This is called Christmas Eve for Mrs. Claus. I just finished it yesterday, so sing along with us. It was a cold Christmas Eve, all the elves had gone home. Santa had packed up his sleigh. Mrs. Claus pet the reindeer and kissed Nick's jolly nose, and the crew went dashing away. One, two, one, two. So she ripped off her itchy, ugly Christmas sweater, grabbed a bottle of red from the underground cellar. She took out her bun for the first time in ages and made some prank calls from the yellow pages. Christmas Eve for Mrs. Claus, Christmas Eve for Mrs. Claus. Anything is possible, and that's because it's Christmas Eve for Mrs. Claus. She danced in the kitchen to Megan the Stallion. She Googled the difference between chives and scallions. She ordered Chinese from the place down the river. It's Christmas Eve, and who else would deliver on Christmas Eve for Mrs. Claus? Christmas Eve for Mrs. Claus. She'll have 8 egg rolls with extra duck sauce on Christmas Eve for Mrs. Claus. Had a box of firecrackers that she lit in the driveway. She went streaking through the town, singing Frank Sinatra's My Way. Right as she ran past the folks at the diner, she slipped on the ice and got a bruise on her hinder. It's Christmas Eve for Mrs. Claus, Christmas Eve for Mrs. Claus. We'll see how far she can bend the laws on Christmas Eve for Mrs. Claus. 12 hours later, she awoke on the couch to a cozy, warm, fuzzy, wet smooch on the mouth. She thought it was Santa, but he was in the kitchen. This wouldn't be the first time she made out with Blitzen. How was your night? Santa asked over eggs, and suddenly Mrs. Claus remembered all the scrapes on her legs. She said, I had some fun and the limits were tested, but at least this year I didn't get arrested. Christmas Eve for Mrs. Claus, Christmas Eve for Mrs. Claus. Let's see how far she can bend the laws. Christmas Eve for Mrs. Claus, Christmas Eve for Mrs. Claus, Christmas Eve for Mrs. Claus. Anything is possible, and that's because it's Christmas Eve for Mrs. Claus. That is ridiculous that you clapped at that song.